The studio lights were blazing hot, but Karoline Leavitt thrived under them. She wore her signature red blazer, her expression sharp as glass. Across from her, seated in the minimalist armchair with his hands calmly folded, sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso's youngest and most controversial leader. The broadcast had just gone live. Tonight, the host announced, we bring you a conversation that's shaking the very foundation of modern geopolitics. On one side, a former White House press aide and rising American conservative star. On the other, a military man who took power and refused to kneel. The crowd was silent as the camera panned to Karoline. She didn't waste a second. You sit here in our studio, she began, her tone clipped and controlled, wearing that tailored suit, speaking English thanks to our universities, and enjoying global media platforms built by our companies. And yet, you rail against the very nations that made all of this possible. She paused. Tell me, Mr. Traoré, with all due respect, do you ever stop and think that you owe us everything? The silence that followed was heavy. Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He let the words hang in the air just long enough. Then he answered, quietly, clearly, and with devastating precision. No, he said. I think you took everything. The host shifted in his chair. The producer's hand hesitated over the mute button. Somewhere backstage, a public relations officer gasped. Karoline leaned forward, her mouth slightly open, suddenly unsure whether to be offended or curious. I beg your pardon, she said, trying to force a smile. You didn't build our soil, Traoré continued. You just mined it. You didn't grow our food, you took it. You didn't educate us, you erased what we knew and called it knowledge. And now you offer us loans for what was already ours. He wasn't raising his voice. That made it worse. Every word was a scalpel. Karoline looked at the host, expecting a lifeline. None came. What about the aid, she snapped. The billions in support? You think that just evaporated? Traoré nodded once. It built palaces in your suburbs and debt in our villages. The audience was still silent, but now it wasn't shock, it was awe. And for the first time in the program's history, the cameras didn't cut to commercial. No one dared move. The war of ideas had begun. Karoline Leavitt wasn't used to being on the defensive. But in that moment, on live television, with the world watching, she was flustered. She shifted in her seat, her fingers subtly tightening around the edge of her cue cards. The segment was supposed to be a masterclass in control, a televised lesson in American diplomacy and moral superiority. But now, the script had gone off course. And Ibrahim Traoré hadn't even raised his voice. Let's be clear, Karoline said finally, trying to regain momentum. You're criticizing a system that feeds the world, stabilizes markets, and promotes democracy. Traoré's eyes didn't waver. Feeds the world, or feeds on it? Karoline forced a laugh. You speak in riddles. I speak in memory, he replied calmly. Memory of how your stabilization meant destabilizing governments. Of how your markets only open when we sell low and buy high. Of how your democracy never reached the villages where your bullets did. There it was again, that quiet fire. Not performance. Not provocation. Just a man telling the truth as he saw it. And somehow, it was more powerful than any applause line Karoline had prepared. The host tried to interject. Let's keep this productive. It is, Traoré interrupted, turning to face him. Productive means honest. That's how real dialogue begins. A producer backstage cursed under his breath. The control room was panicking, ratings were climbing, social media was exploding, but no one could predict where this would go. Back on stage, Karoline decided to change tactics. You criticize the West, she said, but your country's economy, your roads, your hospitals, are funded by it. You depend on us. Traore gave a small smile. No. We survived despite you. The host's eyebrows shot up. Karoline leaned forward, trying to find her footing. So what's your model, Captain? China? Russia? Dictatorships over democracies? Neither, Traore said, his voice turning steel. Our model is our people. Our model is the land beneath our feet and the hands that work it. You wouldn't understand, because your system taught you to measure freedom in GDP and control in drone strikes. Now the studio was dead silent. Even the crew wasn't moving. Somewhere, a CNN anchor was already quoting the line in a reaction segment. Karoline inhaled deeply. She knew she had underestimated him. And now, the narrative was slipping out of her hands. But she wasn't done yet. She was about to hit back, with personal history, American pride, and a challenge that could change the tone of the entire debate. And Traore, calm as ever, was already waiting for it. Karoline adjusted her microphone and narrowed her gaze. The air between them was taut, electrified, as if the very studio lights had picked a side. She realized something: if she couldn't shake him intellectually, she'd shift the ground beneath his feet. You speak with conviction, she said, choosing her words like scalpels. But conviction isn't leadership. Conviction without results is just theater. Traore gave no response, only a stillness that dared her to continue. So let's look at results, Karoline continued, her voice rising. America has built the most resilient democracy on Earth. We've led the fight against tyranny. We've landed on the moon. Where's your moonshot, Captain? It was meant to humiliate. A jab masked as a question. One that would pit Burkina Faso's statistics against America's triumphs. But Traore didn't flinch. Our moon is dignity, he said quietly. And we don't need rockets to reach it, just the courage to say no. Karoline blinked. She hadn't expected poetry. Or power that didn't need volume. We give billions in aid to your region, she said, sharper now. And in return, we ask for stability and cooperation. That's not control. That's partnership. You call it partnership, Traore replied. We call it terms. The audience was silent. Even the host was frozen. Karoline tried again. Without our investment, your schools wouldn't run. Your hospitals wouldn't operate. Traore leaned forward slightly, his tone steady. And without our resources, your phones wouldn't function. Your satellites wouldn't orbit. Your batteries wouldn't charge. She opened her mouth, but had no retort. That's the truth no one wants to say, Traore continued. Africa fuels the world but is told it owes a debt. To whom? The ones who dug into our earth, drained our people, then offered loans to fix the holes they left? His voice never rose. Yet the intensity was undeniable. Karoline tried one last time. If you're right, if everything's so rigged, why stay in the room with us? Traore's answer was instant. Because someone needs to say it. And I'd rather speak in the lion's den than whisper outside it. The words hit like thunder. On Twitter, the clip went viral within minutes. Karoline stared at him. For the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she was winning, or being rewritten. Backstage, the control room was in chaos, but not for the usual reasons. The producers weren't scrambling to cover a scandal. They were scrambling to catch lightning. Keep the cameras rolling, one whispered. Don't cut. This is history. Back on stage, Karoline crossed her legs and reset her posture. She was wounded, but not defeated. If facts couldn't disarm Traore, maybe sentiment could. You speak of dignity, she said slowly. Of sovereignty. But I come from a working-class family. My father was a mechanic. My mother a nurse. I know what it means to struggle. And I know what it means to build. Traore nodded once. Then you also know what it means to lose something you've built. She tilted her head, unsure where he was going. We built too, he said. We built kingdoms before your ancestors learned to map our coasts. We built trade, language, medicine, then watched it vanish beneath ships, guns, and flags we didn't invite. Karoline exhaled sharply. I didn't colonize anyone. And I didn't ask to be lectured about gratitude, Traore replied. The audience shifted uncomfortably. The conversation had moved beyond politics. This was historical reckoning on live television. The host tried to regain control. Let's pivot to solutions. Captain Traore, what does a fair partnership between Africa and the West look like to you? Traore leaned back slightly. Respect. No strings disguised as aid. No bases disguised as security. No advisors disguised as owners. Karoline interrupted, seizing the moment. You're saying we should just walk away? Leave the continent to its own devices? No, Traore answered. I'm saying stop treating us like yours. Karoline looked down at her notes, then pushed them aside. She sensed the futility of scripted lines. What she needed now wasn't a retort. It was a redirection. Ibrahim, she said, using his first name for the first time. What do you want from us? He paused. To listen, he said. Not just with your ears. With your systems. With your policies. With your restraint. The room stilled again. Then maybe, he continued, you'll stop asking why we resist, and start asking why we were forced to. Somewhere in the back row, a journalist whispered, this isn't a debate. It's a reckoning. And Karoline knew she had to make a choice. Keep pushing, or pivot with grace. Karoline sat motionless for a moment, the words still echoing in her mind, stop treating us like yours. She had planned to win this debate on strength. Authority. Numbers. But now the rules were different. The audience wasn't craving dominance, they were watching for truth. And Traore had made them feel it. She adjusted her posture, abandoning the traditional debate stance for something more open, more vulnerable. It was a risk, but losing slowly was worse than shifting fast. I'll admit something, Karoline said, her voice soft but sincere. Your words sting. Not because they're wrong, but because they remind me of how little I know about your reality. Traore didn't gloat. He simply nodded once, acknowledging her honesty. But I do know this, she continued. We can't erase the past. And we can't build trust overnight. But we can start with one thing, mutual responsibility. Traore raised an eyebrow, not in skepticism, but interest. Responsibility, she repeated. If we've built systems that damage, then we have a duty to reform them. But if Africa wants equality, it also has to own its power. Take risks. Fight corruption. Defend liberty, not just from outside, but from within. For the first time, Traore smiled, small, genuine. I agree, he said. The audience sat up straighter. The combat had become conversation. We are doing that, Traore continued. But doing it without being punished for it would help. We ask for clean trade, and get lectures. We ask for partnership, and get conditions. Karoline leaned forward, pressing in. Then why not walk away entirely? Why stay at the table? Because we're not begging to be included, he answered. We're demanding to be respected. She paused, eyes narrowing slightly. And if respect isn't given? Traore held her gaze. Then we'll build a new table. The studio pulsed with silence. This wasn't a threat, it was prophecy. The host cleared his throat. Let me ask what millions are wondering right now, he said, eyes darting between them. Captain Traore, do you trust America? Traore looked directly into the camera. I trust its people more than its policy. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. And clarity, in that moment, was more dangerous than any speech Karoline could have prepared. But she still had one card left to play. And it was personal. Karoline leaned back, her fingers tapping softly on her knee. The calm between them wasn't peace, it was pressure. Pressure to say something that would shift the emotional tide. And she had just the thing. You know, she said, her voice lowered but laced with intent, my brother served in West Africa. Traore's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but calculation. He worked with a U.S. development team, she continued. Built schools. Helped local clinics get supplies. He saw families thrive because of what we brought. She paused. When he came back, he told me something I'll never forget. He said, Karoline, we may be the superpower, but over there, they're the soul. The audience murmured softly. It was a rare moment of vulnerability from her, a glimpse of personal truth. Traore nodded. Then he saw what I wish more of your leaders would see. Karoline leaned in. Then why fight us? Why not join forces and rise together? Traore looked straight at her. Because too often, you say, together, but act alone. The room held its breath. He continued. You fund programs, yes. But you write the rules. You bring food, but you bring it with conditions. You send help, but also troops. And when we resist, you call us unstable. Karoline bit her lip, trying to stay calm. Not all of us want control. Some of us truly want to help. I know, Traore said. But help isn't help when it replaces instead of empowers. There was a beat of silence. Then Karoline played her last hand. You say you want respect. Fine. Then let me ask you this, Mr. Traore. She looked him dead in the eye. Are you willing to admit that without American security, technology, or investment, your fight for independence may take longer, cost more, and risk greater suffering for your people? Traore didn't flinch. Yes, he said flatly. Because freedom that depends on permission isn't freedom at all. Gasps rippled through the audience. The host's face went pale. The social media feed behind the cameras lit up with posts. Karoline blinked. That wasn't just a soundbite. That was a belief system. And suddenly, she realized, she hadn't entered a debate. She had stepped into a worldview. The commercial break came like a wave hitting a wall, loud, sudden, and too late to stop the impact. The cameras cut to black, the host exhaled loudly, and producers flooded the set with whispers and hand signals. But the audience didn't move. Not a soul. Karoline sat perfectly still. Her heart was racing, but her face remained a mask of calm. The team in her earpiece was begging her to pivot, lighten the tone, shift the frame. She ignored them. Traore, meanwhile, simply reached for his water. Still poised. Still unshaken. Outside the studio, the world was waking up to what had just happened. Clips from the first half of the interview were spreading like wildfire. TikTokers were dissecting his lines in real time. Twitter feeds were erupting with quotes like, "We survived despite you," and "Freedom that depends on permission isn't freedom at all." In Nairobi, university students were watching in lecture halls. In Paris, protest organizers were subtitling his words into French. In Washington, junior staffers at the State Department were texting each other, "Are we losing the narrative?" Back on set, the host cleared his throat and leaned forward, attempting to reclaim balance. "Let's bring this back," he said, smiling awkwardly. "We've had some strong words tonight. But maybe, just maybe, we're closer than we think. Karoline? Captain? Is there a path forward between your worldviews?" Karoline glanced at Traore. She knew how this would look, the firebrand conservative finding common ground with a military revolutionary. But something deeper had shifted. She didn't respect him because he challenged her. She respected him because he believed every word he said, and never once needed to shout to prove it. "I don't hate what you're saying," she admitted. Traoré tilted his head, intrigued. "I think you're wrong about a lot," she continued. "But I think you're right about this: people want to own their future." Traoré nodded once. "So let them." Karoline sighed, offering the closest thing to a concession she'd ever given. "Maybe we need to stop defining freedom for everyone else." The host lit up. "There it is. Consensus." But Traoré raised a finger. "Not consensus," he said. "Clarity." Karoline smiled faintly. "You really don't let people off the hook, do you?" "No," Traoré said, calm and firm. "And neither should you." The final segment was approaching, but something strange had happened. No one wanted it to end. Producers who usually begged guests to stick to time were now waving off the clock. Commentators across the globe were already framing this as the interview that redefined the rules. Karoline leaned back, studying Traoré, not as an opponent now, but as a man who had somehow managed to speak like a revolutionary without sounding like a rebel. His words didn't beg for applause. They carried weight because they didn't need it. "You said earlier," Karoline began, "that you'd rather speak in the lion's den than whisper outside of it." Traoré nodded. "Then let me ask you something uncomfortable," she said. "Why should anyone trust a man who took power without an election?" The studio tensed. Traoré didn't hesitate. "Because when I came to power, children were dying in villages while politicians debated in five-star hotels. The old system had ballots, but no bread. Flags, but no fuel." He leaned forward slightly. "If I must choose between legitimacy on paper or survival on the ground, I choose the ground." Karoline watched him carefully. "So when do you give the power back?" "When it belongs to the people again," he said. "Not before." The host glanced toward the control room, unsure if that answer would land as bold, or dangerous. Karoline pushed further. "You speak of dignity. But doesn't real dignity come from the consent of the governed?" Traoré met her eyes, dead center. "Consent," he said, "means nothing when the options are rigged. We didn't have democracy, we had designer cages. Imported and pre-approved." The words hit like iron. But this time, Karoline didn't argue. She just listened. And in that moment, something subtle happened. Across West Africa, radios echoed the interview in French, Hausa, and more. In the US, civil rights groups began posting clips of Traoré's comments with captions like, "He's saying what no one else dares." And in Burkina Faso, villagers gathered around flickering televisions, watching their president not as a military figure, but as a voice in a world that rarely lets theirs be heard. The interview had started as a political showdown. Now it felt like something more. Something historical. The final minutes of the broadcast loomed, but neither Traoré nor Karoline looked ready to close. The host, sensing something rare and magnetic, let the moment breathe. Traoré rested his hands on the armrest. Calm. Collected. But beneath the stillness, a storm of history. "You want to know the hardest part of being in my position?" he asked, not just to Karoline, but to the world. Karoline nodded slowly. "It's not rebuilding roads," he said. "It's not feeding families or defending borders. It's knowing that the moment you raise your head and say, 'We want different,' someone, somewhere will call you dangerous." He paused, scanning the room. "They won't say it out loud. Not always. But they'll tighten loans. Freeze assets. Fund whispers. Because independence spoken too clearly sounds like rebellion to those who benefit from silence." Karoline exhaled quietly. There it was again, that unflinching clarity. That refusal to dilute truth. "And yet," he continued, "I speak. Not because I expect applause, but because silence never fed a child. It never protected a village. It never built a future. The host leaned in. If the price of speaking is isolation, are you willing to pay it? Traoré nodded. Yes. Because dignity costs more than fear. And we've been renting our dignity for far too long. Karoline sat back, letting his words settle. Her team in her ear urged her to pivot, to regain control of the narrative. But she muted them. She wasn't here to win anymore. She was here to understand. You said earlier that we took everything, she said. Maybe we did. Traoré looked at her, surprised. But here's what I'll say, she added. I can't undo history. I can't fix what I didn't break. But I can choose to see you not as a symbol of resistance, but as a man worth listening to. Traoré nodded once. No smile. Just acknowledgement. And if others don't want to listen, she asked. Then let them cover their ears, he replied. Truth doesn't need permission to echo. Silence again. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was sacred. The credits had rolled. The cameras shut off. The studio lights dimmed. But the conversation refused to end. Ibrahim Traoré stood up first, buttoned his jacket, and extended a hand toward Karoline. She took it, reluctantly, then firmly. It wasn't victory. It was mutual recognition. Backstage, producers were already debating how to frame the headlines. Was it a debate? A reckoning? A moment of global introspection? One thing was certain, the world had witnessed something that didn't follow any playbook. And neither side had walked away unchanged. That night, Karoline rode back to her hotel in silence. Her team buzzed around her, press requests, viral tweets, reactions from every corner of the political spectrum. But she wasn't listening. Her mind was on a single line. Freedom that depends on permission isn't freedom at all. At that very moment, halfway across the Atlantic, Traoré was landing back in Ouagadougou. He stepped off the plane to a silent crowd, not orchestrated, not formal. Just people. Dozens. Then hundreds. Then thousands. They didn't chant. They didn't wave flags. They just stood. Watched. And nodded. Because he had gone into the lion's den, and returned with their voice intact. Within 24 hours, international news agencies declared the interview a turning point in global discourse. The New York Times called it the most honest political conversation of the decade. Le Monde described Traoré as the man who made silence impossible. But the most powerful response came not from headlines, but from homes. In South Africa, a teenager wrote in her journal, "He made me feel like my future belongs to me." In rural Ohio, a college student tweeted, "You don't have to agree with him to realize he's not wrong." And in a village in Burkina Faso, an old woman turned to her grandson and said, "We've had leaders before. But he's something else." In a world addicted to noise, Traoré had done something rare, he had spoken softly, and changed everything. And Karoline Leavitt? She went on to write an op-ed. Not a rebuttal, not a correction. But a reflection. Its title. The Day I Sat Across from a Man Who Didn't Flinch. Sometimes, history isn't made by declarations. Sometimes, it's made by one line, spoken softly, but heard forever. What you just witnessed wasn't a clash of nations, it was a collision of truths. On one side, a voice shaped by power and legacy. On the other, a voice forged in silence, sharpened by history, and carried by a generation that refuses to be spoken for. When Karoline Leavitt asked, "Don't you owe us everything?" she didn't expect the answer to be a mirror. "You took everything," Traoré said. Not with rage. Not with blame. But with a clarity that pierced beyond the debate. This wasn't about America versus Africa. It was about perception versus reality. Comfort versus confrontation. Privilege versus purpose. In a world desperate for applause, Traoré chose something harder: truth without permission. And in doing so, he reminded us that real leadership isn't about dominating a room. It's about daring to speak, even when you're not supposed to. And sometimes, that's the loudest sound of all.